Edelglass. I serve here as Director of Studies at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies in Barry, Massachusetts, on the traditional homelands of the Nipmuc people who are still living in this area. And in fact, in August, Sister Siddhartha Jackson, a colleague of Lama Rod's, gave a Nipmuc language performance in our Dharma hall. And we are co-sponsoring this program, collaborating with the Natural Dharma Fellowship in Wonderwell, led by Lama Willa Baker and Lama Liz Munson. And I want to begin by also acknowledging how grateful we are for our collaboration with Wonderwell and the many institutional and personal friendships that we have as we work together to support the Dharma. If you would like to have closed captions and see the words that are being spoken in live time, you can go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and press the button which says live transcript and CC for closed caption, and you will be able to read the words that are being spoken. For introducing Lama Rod, I'd like to give some sense of how our time together will unfold. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions when you registered. We are going to begin with me posing some questions from there and also some of my own. And then we are going to move to questions from any of you in response to what Lama Rod is saying. And you can submit your questions to me by sending them through the chat. And I think there are a lot more questions than we will have time for, which is a good thing, because living with a question is often as good as getting an answer. If you're having any technical difficulties at any point, please feel free to email contact@buddhistinquiry.org. And a special thank you to my colleagues, Mindy and Cassie, who are on the call now and who are making everything run smoothly. While Lama Rod and I are speaking, you will only be able to message me. However, initially, maybe Cassie and Mindy, if this is possible, if we could open the chat and invite everyone to put into the chat where you're calling from. And perhaps if we could go to gallery view for half a minute and everybody could just wave to each other so we get a sense of who's here. And maybe you could just put in the chat, thank you, where you're calling in from. It's a remarkable thing that we can all be together from all these different places all over. Okay, so it's sweet to see some familiar faces and really a warm, warm welcome to everyone. Okay, thank you, Mindy and Cassie. So I think I speak for others, but I'll just speak for myself when I say that when I've been sitting when Lama Rod has been teaching, I think one of the most powerful things for me is the way Lama Rod speaks with a kind of truthfulness and openness and honesty and vulnerability that has a liberating power, both as for Dharma and Dharma practice, understood individually, but also socially. I think that's a really powerful thing. That is the beginning of my introduction to you, Lama Rod. One of the ways in which that is manifest is that Lama Rod is a Black Buddhist Southern Queen. And I think that is a very powerful teaching, just beginning an introduction with that. More conventionally, he is the author of Love and Rage, The Path of Liberation Through Anger, and co-author of Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation. And most recently, author of The New Saints, From Broken Hearts to Spiritual Warriors, which is what will be the primary focus of our conversation tonight and was just released. And in addition to this, there it is, with that compelling picture on the front. In addition to Lama Rod's writing and his scholarly background includes a Master's of Divinity in Buddhist Studies from Harvard Divinity School, and also a deep meditation training, having completed a 3-year traditional retreat in the Kagyu School of Tibetan Buddhism, in which he is an authorized teacher, which is one of the reasons I really love when Lama Rod teaches at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, because he integrates study and practice in the way that we want our teachers to. He's also the co-founder of Bhumi Sparsha, which seeks to make Tantra accessible and inclusive for practitioners in North America, while also serving as a catalyst for transformative social change. And he's also a co-founder of Dharma Queens with Sister Siddhartha, which is a series of conversations that you can watch on Instagram Live. It has a very different quality from many other Dharma offerings that are available. So that is my introduction to you, Lama Rod. And maybe before we start our conversation, if you'd be willing to lead us in a settling meditation for a few minutes.
Absolutely. Thank you, William. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in today, this evening, or afternoon, wherever you are. It's so really wonderful to share this space with you all. And just as I begin to, I'm situated on the ancestral lands of the Creek Muskogee and Cherokee people. Land that is still being taken care of by the elders of these communities. And so I bring you greetings from this land that we call Atlanta now, a land that everyone wants to move to, but I think we're booked. I think we're set. So, but I understand the the temptation to move here. But I just wanted to begin with just a little bit of grounding meditation, a little grounding practice. Just allowing your awareness just to return back to this timeline, to this moment. Just beginning to notice first the space around you, and all the qualities and the expressions of the space, including light and temperature and different objects in the space around you. And when you're ready, just shifting your attention to your seat and just noticing the weight of your body and the seat rising to hold you. And I wonder if you can just allow the seat to take care of you, to hold you as we enter into our conversation. And maybe even connecting to the land or the earth under you. And feeling the earth rise to hold not just you, but all of us in this very moment. It is the same earth that's holding all of us in this very second, as well as holding all beings connected to the land, both seen beings as well as unseen beings. Just again, letting the land hold you, And if you want, offering just a prayer that the land continues to hold all of us, particularly all of us who are struggling for safety and resources or happiness or community. May the earth rise to hold everyone seeking to belong and seeking to be resourced. Just allowing the energy of earth to really rise and express itself in the space, both in us and around us. Feeling the grounding and the stabilization and the nurturing of the earth. And maybe if there's something that we're struggling to hold for ourselves, any anger or fear or sadness or heartbreak or longing, I invite you to imagine just offering this energy to the earth. And the earth is not going to be harmed or anything like that. We're just offering energy back to energy. And letting go of just holding on to everything and just opening, expanding, perhaps relaxing just a little bit. And letting the earth hold us, as well as the seat. And whatever aspirations or hopes or intentions that you have for this conversation, I invite you just to bring it into the forefront of your mind. Notice it. And again, offer it down into the earth as something that we're planting and we'll begin to water and tend to as we begin our conversation. Once that intention or aspiration has been planted, I invite you to return back to the space. If your eyes were closed, gently opening your eyes, maybe even inviting some simple, slow movement back to your bodies. Maybe even a few deep cleansing breaths, breathing into the nose, out of the mouth, releasing anything that feels stuck or heavy. And as we begin our conversation, just always remembering that you can return back to the earth for care, for support, that you can do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself in this conversation. Right? Because there's no liberation without care. First for ourselves, and then for our communities, and our beloveds, and our relations. Right. So thank you everyone for your practice.
Thank you, Lama Rod. I wonder if we could start with some of the practice that you just shared with us, which also reminds me of the prologue to your book, where you go outside on the porch and the you feel the land grateful for your presence. Um, I wonder if you would be willing to say a little bit about um, why that is a place of beginning tonight and in your book. And I know later on in the book you talk about there's the chapter on touching the earth, and maybe this is anticipating a little bit of what comes there, but it seems to be a very important place of beginning for you. And maybe we could start there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, the land that I live on is also the same land, William, you used to live on, actually the very same street that I'm living on now, you lived on. And so when I think about the earth, I think about freedom, right? There's no freedom without the earth, right? And I think about the Buddha who touched the earth, as he was nearing his enlightenment to to receive this kind of validation and support from the earth, right? To remind him that he indeed has a right to get free, right? Um, there's so much struggle over land and territory right now, and it has been for many centuries. Um, but even deeper than that for me, my body is an expression of the earth. And the earth is an expression of my body. And so when I think about anything beneficial, particularly the work of liberation, I always start with the earth. I have to touch the earth in the same way the Buddha touched the earth to experience groundedness, to experience belonging, right? To experience the care of what I consider an awakened being, right? We're so disconnected from the land, from the earth, right? And I think that is also one of the main reasons behind climate change and climate instability. I think we have forgotten, many of us have forgotten how to be in relationship to the earth and the land, to listen to the land, to feel the land, right? And if we are experiencing disembodiment, right, or disassociation, it makes it harder for us to touch the land because I can only touch the earth through my body, you know? And so I think one of the great challenges of our age is a returning back to our bodies and thus a returning back to the earth, to touch the earth, um, and to allow the earth to support us in our work of reducing harm and violence and ultimately getting free as well. Um, I mean, so it's just to finish up this part, right? The earth is always asking us for community, for reunion, for remembering, right? To return back to our most natural selves, right? I can only feel that by first beginning with touching the earth, feeling the earth under me, listening to the earth, feeling the life of the earth, feeling how all life forms are connected through the earth, feeling as if I belong to a kind of both natural and as well as a sacred ecology, right? That is not me, but it's us, right? And if we allow it, the earth is always rising to hold us, to lift us up, to nurture us. If we can just remember that and return back to that kind of sacred, profound care. So,
Thank you. I wonder if you'd be willing to say a few words about the very last paragraph of the prologue, which is where you've finished your pipe, you've said your prayers, you feel complete for the night, and you leave a final offering of grains, water, light, and incense on the porch for a bribe for those beings who may be pissed at you, hoping they accept this offering instead of fucking with you. And I think it's one thing to talk about the earth as something to be grounded in, but it's another thing to do ritual and ceremony. And I'm wondering if you could say a few words about that, that is maybe a little bit different from the general abstract talking about connection to the earth.
Yeah, ritual and ceremony are forms of communication, right? With the physical world, with the unseen world, right? And we're always doing ritual. A ritual isn't good or bad. A ritual is simply a ritual. We're all we're I think we're very aware of rituals of harm that we're doing to the earth, you know. But a ritual of care, it's when I ask, in this case, the earth, and the beings connected to the earth, what they need right now. What can I do? Right. And that's when our relationship to earth and the land transforms, when we ask, what do I need to do? What do I need to offer? Right. Because all of our ancestors had this sacred connection to the land. you know Maybe for some of us, our earliest ancestors, but for some of us, ritual with the earth never was disrupted. So this feels very natural. But when I touch the earth is always asking for balance, for communication, for support, not just necessarily for itself, but how supporting the earth is ultimately supporting my body and my communities and my relations, right? So when I do rituals like leaving greens and incense and light, it's the recognition that I'm not the only being um, seeking to get resources, and gather resources from the land. And it's also a recognition that there are many ways in which I unknowingly and unconsciously create harm for beings, as we all do. That is the shadow part of interdependence. Like, we're always impacting everything else, knowingly or unknowingly, right? And so this is, leaving of like just food and grains and light is just, in many ways can be a very small offering, but with big ramifications for other beings, as really an offering of remembrance. I remember you, I recognize you. Here is an offering. It's not a lot, but it's the gesture, the intention that actually gives power to ritual. And very much in Tibetan Buddhism, we have these two kind of, I don't want to say sayings, but these two philosophies. If you have materials for ritual, use them. If you don't have anything, imagine it. But at the end of the day, it's the intention that gives power to our actions, to our generosity. So this is what I do. I try to do this all the time as much as possible throughout my day. And I think this is one of the ways in which Tibetan Buddhism has really taught me, how to return back to ritual and to an expression of indigeneity. And for me, indigeneity is a connection to the natural world, right? But I think this is what we're all being called back to, is back into rituals that involve the land and really all the elements, right? To remember that we're not the only beings connected to this land, that we're living on top of and with so many other kinds of beings. And we have to remember, we have to start acknowledging that again, right? Because so much of the trouble I think that we're moving through can also be attributed to the ways in which we've lost belief and contact with the unseen world. You know, so many systems and things have arisen to disrupt our connection to the earth and to the unseen, including capitalism, right? Including, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of patriarchy, white supremacy, colonization, imperialism, right? And so I want to reconnect to my inherent capacity to be in direct conversation with the unseen world as well as the natural world. And for me, that's what it means to be human, to be fully, authentically human, is to be in deep conversation and community with the unseen.
Now, one of the things I really appreciate about the book is the way in which it takes what one might think of as very traditional, very classical teachings and translates them into a contemporary language, a contemporary medium. And my own view is that Buddhist traditions, pretty much all classical Buddhist traditions, have been animist. Wherever you look, there's animism from the very beginning. And in some ways, that little ritual at the end is a very, very traditional way of being a Buddhist. And I think what I find lovely about that little passage is that it's also an invitation to the reader to embody a certain way of communicating with the natural world, even if it we don't maybe necessarily believe in all the metaphysics behind it, but the ritual, the gesture enacts um, this quality that we're trying to cultivate, I think is very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a return back to fluidity and space and movement, because the material world can feel very claustrophobic without ritual and ceremony and mythologies, right? We get too trapped in the realness of everything, and we have to shake it off. Just like Mariah Carey told us, we have to shake it off. And Mariah Carey, not Taylor Swift, by the way, just for some of you young people. Mariah Carey said it first. All right.
Okay, so Lama Rod, what do you mean by a new saint in the
Yeah.
title of your book? What's a new saint?
Yeah. Well, the new saint is you were just pointing out, this kind of contemporary expression of the bodhisattva, the spiritual warrior in Buddhism, or the Buddhist saint. But when all this was coming up, and the book was really presenting itself to me during the quarantine of 2020, after my last book, Love and Rage, was published, just looking at the world, looking at the pandemic, looking at the murder of George Floyd, and so many things around capitalism that people were really finally becoming aware of, I thought, oh, we need a different kind of translation of spiritual sainthood. So I think sometimes the notion of saint feels very lofty and very abstract, and it feels very far away. And I think it makes it hard for us to really embody and actualize these really basic tenets of sainthood, right? And so I think new saints, for me, is getting back to these basic expressions of a saint, not necessarily like the magical powers or the healing powers, the clairvoyancy of saints. That's not actually what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the basic expression of a saint who actually just cares. Like, they just care about people. They care about people's safety and healing and well-being. And that's something that we're losing in this culture. We're not caring about each other enough, right? It's just, and it's heartbreaking, how we objectify each other, and blame people for the suffering or the violence that they're experiencing. That's a lack of care. And that lack of care that says everything about you, you know? And that's scary for me. And so when this book started really coming up for me, I was like, no, like, I want us to return back to caring, right? And of course, in the book, I call it giving a shit. You need to give a shit, in terms of like contemporary language, which is what I use. Just give a fucking shit, like, and not only do you give a shit, you figure out what your work is, and you do your work, and you come back and do your work. None of this is supposed to be fun. Like, it's not glamorous, it's not sexy, but this is the work of liberation. And just as importantly, this is the work of caring for one another, right? So that's the new saint. Like, we have to enter into this new expression of divinity that's really grounded in the world, grounded in our basic relationships with one another, based upon deep, deep care and a deep concern with people's safety and freedom. That's what it is, and I think that's what the bodhisattva is, you know.
I found it very powerful when you begin talking about the new saint by proclaiming that um, I am a new saint and I want you, the reader, to join me. Um, I can imagine a story about why that feels liberating and why that can be liberating, perhaps based on an understanding of the bodhisattva. But I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about why you begin that way by declaring yourself a new saint and inviting others to become saints with you.
I think a big issue with a lot of Dharma practitioners is that a lot of us aren't practicing to get free. We're practicing to get comfortable and adjusted and assimilated, right? A lot of us aren't actually practicing for liberation because I think part of it is that we don't actually believe that we can get free from suffering. But it feels nice, in the process. And for me, what I've understood, because I descend from enslaved people, right? And I particularly am trained, and raised in like Black prophetic traditions, Black liberatory traditions, Black liberation theology. Like these are just things I grew up with. This is what, we were preaching in church and learning and studying, that like we're committed to getting free, right? And I brought that into Dharma. And so for me, when I first really started practicing Buddhism, I was like, of course I want to get free, but I don't think that's the agenda for a lot of folks, right? And when you really start working to get free, you have to get audacious, right? And that audaciousness can be confused as arrogance, right? Like you have to love yourself enough to want to be free. Like you have to really develop a real care for yourself to start cutting through this bullshit, right? And I evoke, and think about Harriet Tubman all the time, who's one of my saints, right? Who was like, listen, I'm going to get free or I'm going to die. I'm going to get one of those, right? How do we get back, to that stance, which I call an abolitionist stance? The abolitionist work, right, is to disrupt all systems of violence, but that disruption of violence is really about getting free, right? Returning back. So I can't get you on board to this project if I'm just like, oh, yeah, maybe a saint, possibly I'm a queen, but do queens get free? Like I only listen to people who, and if you as well, like we all listen to people who are really confident. Like confidence sells, right? But when you're talking about liberation, I'm not interested in people who are very ambivalent about freedom. I'm interested in people who are very clear about where they're going and how they're inviting people to join them, And so that's why I have to start out with this. Like, this isn't a big deal for me. Actually, like, this is a big deal for a lot of us who are struggling to actually understand what care feels like for ourselves, right? Because saying that you're a saint and saying that you're going to get free is actually one of the most profound statements of self-love that one can make. That I deserve to get free. I do not deserve to be a victim of anyone's violence. I don't deserve to be a victim of this delusion or samsara, which I call the carceral state in the book. This is not if I'm a Buddha, then why am I dealing with this? Like you have to that's the kind of clarity. This is how I talk to myself. Like if I'm a Buddha, why am I consenting to chaos and confusion, right? Why am I consenting to these acts of violence? So I am a new saint. It's okay if you're not, or if you're having to like work up to this. That's wonderful. We all have to start somewhere. right? But this book, you have to understand that what I'm talking about is freedom, not happiness, right? If you don't get that, then there's going to be a misunderstanding in what I'm doing in this project.
Maybe that's a an opportune moment to ask about the path of freedom and the way that the path of freedom, as you understand it, I believe, has a certain amount of suffering in it as one um, lets go, simultaneously embraces and lets go certain kinds of identities and certain ways of being that one has carried. Would you be willing to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it really reminds me of the first time I started practicing meditation. And when I sat down and started practicing, like this really intense suffering would just kind of come out of nowhere. And I said, oh, this is hurting me. Like, why does anyone want to meditate? Right. And it took me a little while to understand that, like, I wasn't hurting more. It was just that I was paying attention to it for the first time. Right. And we talk about liberation and going through suffering. It's like, no, I actually have to actually tend to and take care of suffering by learning to pay attention to it so I can actually begin to divest from the causes and conditions that perpetuate suffering, which mostly is delusion, ignorance, right? I'm trying to get clear about things, but until I get clear, I have to name the places where I'm not clear. And that feels really hard for many of us to do, right? Um, for me, when the Buddha offered the first noble truth, which, he said that there was suffering in life, I just felt like that was the kindest thing that anyone had ever said to me, and that's what, like, that was the line that got me to sign up for Buddhism, because I wasn't being gaslit, like, I am suffering. And the Buddha said, and you're not imagining this. Well, you are. Like, you are definitely imagining this, but relatively it's happening. Like, this isn't like you're actually really uncomfortable right now. And maybe you should deal with that instead of trying to bypass it to get to happiness and pleasure. I was like, sign me up, sign me up. And that, you know, for all of us, like, we have to transform our relationship to discomfort. And one of the ways that I learned as I deepened my practice was to learn how to welcome and invite discomfort to my practice, because it was already there, you know? And it's like trying to keep a guest from getting into your house, or it's rather like this: you already have a house full of guests, but you haven't welcomed them, right? But like, suffering is already present, just like a guest in a home is always already present. So why don't you just say, welcome, here you are? I may not want you here, but you're here. For me, that cut through a lot of suffering, like that cut through a lot of aversion and pushing back. And that actually helped me to be in a much more transformative relationship with suffering and pain and just discomfort in general, right? To welcome it, you know, um, and to let go of all this fear of suffering, right? Um, this has completely transformed my practice. This idea, this practice of welcoming the pain, you know.
Yeah, thank you. There's the welcoming the pain. There's also, in your discussion of the new saint, a letting go of the need to be perceived as good. And in some sense, the new saint is beyond goodness, you say, in a obviously the new saint is good in some ways, but I'm wondering if you would be willing to talk about the importance of letting go of how other people see you as part of this cultivation of awakened care.
I think the ways that we practice goodness can be very performative, especially in the age of social media, where we can perform or convey anything that we want. We can tell a story and get anyone to believe in it because it's just images on a computer on a screen, right? And I think for me, goodness is something that I'm always earning. It's a choice that I'm making moment to moment. It's not a place that I am just rooted in, right? This is why I say I'm not a good person, but I'm trying to practice goodness in the moment. And for me, practicing goodness means that I'm trying to choose the reduction of harm and violence for myself and for others, second to second, right? I don't always make it. Every some seconds I choose violence and pettiness and drama, right? Sometimes because it's fun, other times because like I just don't have the energy, right? But I wanted to convey the idea that goodness is active, is always active, and we have to stay on top of choosing what is conducive to getting free, which is the reduction of harm and violence, right? Um, the problem that I have is with good people. Like if you're a good person, then it's really hard for you to see the times when you're not good. You know, when you're practicing goodness from second to second, there are spaces in between each second where certain, qualities that are not necessarily conducive to goodness are able to be seen and worked with, right? And I think that's really incredibly important. I think the performance of goodness is really about us being vulnerable or not being vulnerable, right? I think we all want to be liked and validated and celebrated, but if we're not seen as good, then that becomes problematic for us. But the practice of goodness is also really messy as well. This idea of perfection it has to be disrupted. Like you can't get free and look good at the same time, right? You can't keep making really difficult decisions about care and still thinking you're going to come out looking pristine, right? Like we have to let that go. We have to let go of how we're constantly being shaped by other people's validation, right? And this is why we don't like to be messy. And I think this is why these notions of perfection are so pervasive for us. Like we don't want to be seen or exposed, but if you're going to get free, you will be exposed. This whole book is nothing but me emptying myself out on the pages and saying, here you are. I mean, here I am for you, right? And I am okay with exposing this because I've worked really hard to develop this deep level of care that holds me and takes care of me as I show you where I struggle as a new saint, right? That's goodness, right? Like when we're just saying, you know what, I'm going to do what I can do to care, to benefit, to help, and it may not look great, but this is the best that I can do. That's wonderful. Like I know if people are working because they look like hell, you know, like I don't necessarily trust people who are just really just like everything's great, everything's wonderful, my practice is wonderful, it's great, and I'm like, well, you're not actually practicing, actually, or at least you're practicing the easy stuff, right? And if it's easy, it's probably not your practice. Practice with the hardship.
I feel like I want to let that sit for a minute. I want to open up to questions from participants. Um, if people have questions, they can start sending them to me through the chat. And I would also like to ask a few more questions from the book explicitly, Lama Rod.
Cool.
And maybe one is what it means to you to work with the ancestors.
Yeah.
And there's an element that is very traditionally Buddhist there. And it's not necessarily part of a lot of people's contemporary Buddhist practice. And
Yeah, because it's a great way to bypass our connection to the violence of our ancestors. Ancestor work for me is imperative on this path. Ancestors, I talk about this, in detail in the book, but the ancestors are these beings who are connected to us. They consent to being connected to us. And they're not just familial ancestors. These aren't just like old family members, right? These are just all kinds of beings who see themselves reflected in our path and in our life, and they are drawn to us energetically. They kind of like link with us energetically, and in that linking there's a responsibility that comes about, right? But for me, ancestor practice has been this really profound way of deepening liberation work, because the unseen world wants to be free as much as we want to be free, or we think we want to be free. So ancestor work is such a profound way that we can experience deep care, profound care, and support from these beings, and we can return that care to them. And when we start working collaboratively, then our spiritual path really deepens very quickly, right? We talk about benefiting beings. Well, there's still healing that needs to happen with our ancestors, and we can be a part of that. The healing that we experience is also the healing that our ancestors experience, and vice versa. The healing that they experience through us also deeply benefits us. And not only does it benefit us, but one of the things that you realize in ancestral work and ancestral cleansing is that it begins to benefit people around us, more particularly our families. The people that we have chosen as family or our blood family actually are directly impacted by ancestral cleansing and healing that we do, because we're all, again, interdependent, right? Ancestors and family and friends, there's a deeper kind of interdependence that we share as well, So if you come from really hard family dynamics, I think ancestral work is something that you can look into, right? I think so much of the things I used to struggle with in my actual family have been rooted within ancestral trauma, particularly intergenerational and transhistorical traumas that have been passed, through my line. And once I really took on cleansing those energies, my family really, I think, began to change, right? And my family doesn't know that I wrote a whole chapter about our ancestors in the book, so it'll be a surprise for them when they get it. But yeah, and I think part of my work is in this idea of like American Buddhism, which we still have centuries to go before that happens. But my contribution, I hope, is to center ancestral work, right? Again, just like disembodiment and climate change, I think so much of the issues that we're working through also are ancestral, right? And it's energies that are held but haven't been tended to. So traumas held in the earth from genocide, war, and so forth, right? The generational traumas that we all struggle with, that deeply impact our family and our life and our health, all that has to be cleansed and worked with, right? We can't, to get free, you have to accept everything. Like everything has to be brought into awareness, everything, right? Including the ancestors, including all the shit that we don't want to deal with, including the trauma that we can't even touch right now. Eventually that has to be brought into awareness and metabolized, everything, right? So that means that like work is ongoing. No, not that you can't take a break, but realizing it's like peeling back an onion. You're getting deeper and deeper and deeper until you get to the emptiness. And you're like, there we go. I'm enlightened. I don't think you would say that though, when you achieve enlightenment. I think you'll just be like, okay, that was great. See you later. No, but a bodhisattva returns back to help, unless you're a solitary realizer.
Lama Rod, for folks who may not know where to start to work with the ancestors, do you have a few words that might point in some possible directions other than the book and maybe a few things you could share here?
Yeah. Well, you don't have to know who your ancestors are, first and foremost. So this isn't necessarily starting with a research project and a DNA test, right? But for me, I started my ancestor practice by first just reflecting on ancestors, who they were, how they fit into my practice, considering the possibility that I am like surrounded by these beings, right? That was the first step. It's just like, okay, how can I bring this into my worldview? And secondly, I just began to talk to them, right? And I began to particularly ask for the ways in which they were trying to communicate with me, right? So that's a powerful question, right? So prepare yourself when you ask for communication. The ancestors will reveal the ways in which they communicate with you. And I began to experience that. And I said, oh, like this is communication. This isn't just some random feeling that I have, or the physical sensation sometimes that I have with certain situations. That's not a random thing. That's them actually shifting energy around me to get my attention. And so I just learned how to read that. And that deepened into, developing relationships with particular ancestors, right? And there are so many traditions, particularly indigenous-based traditions of ancestor work, that I've been influenced by as well. And so every tradition, has kind of different kind of procedures around this. But again, just talking, asking for signs, and ask, if there is a particular way you want to communicate, ask for that. I have a dear friend who only talks to ancestors in dreams, and that's her boundary. So you can set these boundaries and say, this is when I'm most open or most interested in communicating, and let them like shape, their communication around those boundaries. So like it's, so these are just the basic things, right? And then over time you get led, you will feel deep intuitions to go further, like setting up an ancestor altar, making offerings on that altar. Even, you may be led to intervene. You may be carrying messages from the ancestors to your living family as well. And that gets real tricky. That's like becoming Whoopi Goldberg and Ghost, or Della Reese and Touched by an Angel. For those of you who are old enough to remember Touched by an Angel, it's just in the 90s, but I recognize some of you weren't born in the 90s. But Touched by an Angel, right? It's just like these angels that go around delivering messages, or whatever they did. But it was mostly like Whoopi Goldberg. It can turn into that. And so you can make decisions about how to handle that, but it's really deepened and enriched my practice and my life. And I just don't feel alone. I feel like there are all these beings who are looking out for me, and I don't feel so afraid of the world anymore. I don't feel so afraid of the unseen world anymore, because I feel like they're protecting me.
Thank you. One of the questions that was just asked from a participant speaks directly to some of the things that can come up, as you mentioned, when one does get in touch with the ancestors. And I think I'm just going to read what this person shared. What happens when folks around you aren't ready for the healing that happens in collaboration with your ancestors? For me, it's cost me everything, and I've been met with violence of all sorts. Can you speak to that at all? Thank you so much again.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. That's a really important question. Part of my kind of like ethical framework around ancestor work is that like I get consent from people before I share messages, particularly with my family. I just don't say, you know what, then, great grandmama so and so said that you need to do X, Y, and Z. It's not really the kind of family that I come from. And so I tend to really hold messages until I feel as if there's some space for consent to happen, and I just ask, you know, or I share information in a way that doesn't seem like it's coming from, you know, this experience of ancestors. The consent piece is really important, and this is a big part of the book that I try to convey is that if people aren't ready to get healed or ready to get free, then you can't force them to do so, right? That's another issue that we're having in our contemporary world, right? And living together in a global community. There are people, who are being forced into things that they have not consented into, right? And we have to understand how that plays out in our interpersonal relationships as well as our familial relationships. So if people aren't ready, hold it. And then it's important to understand that you have the right to set boundaries, right? I set boundaries, energetic boundaries, whatever, intentional boundaries around how I work, and what I do and what I'm able to communicate and convey to others. It's okay to say no. I can't do that right now. I can't relay that message. I can't tell this person X, Y, and Z. You know, um, so I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Lama Rod. And I also just want to acknowledge um, to you who chatted me the question that to feel that the cost is so big and you've met with violence. I just want to take a moment to hold that. My heart is with you. Um, may your ancestors support you. Lama Rod, one of the really powerful dimensions of your teaching is the role of the body and embodiment and the vulnerability of the body, the power of the body as a primary place of practice. Would you be willing to say a little bit about the role of the body for you in our on the path?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, for me, this is rooted in the life of the Buddha, right? The Buddha who was, sitting under the tree trying to get awakened, was completely kind of disregarding his body. Like he just got so emaciated and starved, and he just hit a plateau in his practice. And he came out of samadhi and was like, why am I, what's wrong? Why am I not going anywhere? And then you begin to understand that the body has to be invited into liberation. And that invitation is through caretaking of our bodies, because our bodies are vehicles for us in this path, in this, reality. I can't get free until everything is invited. My whole self, including my body, is invited into liberation work, right? And so for me, I spent so many years running away from my body, really being ashamed of my body. Many of us have. Again, we live in this kind of like perfectionist culture, particularly if you live here in America or in the West in general, right? And our bodies have been shaped by other people's needs and appetites and desires, rarely by our own. Right. And for me, my Dharma practice has been about coming back to my body and really asking my body what it needs. Right. And bringing awareness to the body too, meaning that like I've had to start naming and sitting with and moving through a lot of physical trauma, as well. This is how I learned to take care of my body, and how my body, because it's being taken care of, is so supportive in this project of liberation, as well. but again, you know, if we're struggling with our bodies, you know, it's really the antidote to struggling with our body is really developing and going through this path of awakening deep care for ourselves and for our bodies, and beginning to disrupt other people's expectations of our bodies. You know, for me, I had to disrupt the judgment of my body as well, you know, which was incredibly important. Um, and you start expanding. Once you start this work, you start expanding, you start taking up space, you know. I feel better, you know, because I take care of my body, and I'm able to name my body on my own terms, right? So yeah, I mean, that's, you know, this is imperative work for all of us, you know.
We live in a society which I think can be fairly characterized as fat phobic. Um, Fat studies and fat liberation has given a lot of critical perspectives on how most of us feel, regardless of how we think. And it's something that very few teachers explicitly address. You are an exception. I'm wondering if you would be willing to say a little bit about um, fatness and how that can come into our practice.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I had to reclaim that word, because words like fat and so many other kinds of words are intentionally weaponized against so many of us, you know. And there's a particular kind of judgment, you know, against, you know, fat bodies that says, oh, we don't deserve, or we're unhealthy, or we don't belong, or we have failed at this project of perfection, right? And so much of this policing of the body is really rooted in white supremacy, you know, and anti-blackness. You know, fat studies is actually rooted in slavery, you know, as people begin to use the bodies of Black people as the antithesis to what a perfect body could be, you know. So not only am I fat, I'm Black, right? And that creates this double whammy, you know. And I guess got to a point where I was just like, I'm no longer interested in being shaped by other people's deep insecurities, you know. And again, deep care, deep love, you know, were the paths for me to start reclaiming this, right? To disrupt you know, this misunderstanding that fatness is directly linked to unhealthiness, you know, like to disrupt that and to begin to create space where we're able to talk about our bodies and the ways that we struggle with our bodies, you know, and the way that genetics, you know, and all kinds of things shapes how our bodies emerge in this reality. Um, so yeah, and I think this is just something that it's another frontier for American Dharma, but like, what isn't a frontier for American Dharma? You know, I think we've already claimed the frontier of happiness and comfort. So that's well populated. Right now, I think we need to move on to some other subject matter as well. But yeah, and it's heartbreaking too. Absolutely. You know, it's not just, again, fat bodies, it's just bodies and the ways our bodies are manipulated and constructed, you know, in such ways that like go against our own happiness and belonging and joy, like to start disrupting that, because all this is other people's insecurities weaponized against us. And then we internalize those insecurities and confuse it as our own desires and wants, you know. Feminist studies have done really, you know, this incredible work in feminist studies, you know, that has begun to unpack, you know, body and perfection and desire and so forth, you know. So Yeah, and I talk about this in the book as well, definitely, that you can read more about there.
Thank you. I I hope it is clear to everybody that um, for you the path is about surrendering to the dark on some level, that the broken heart is a really important part of this path, and this is not a path, as you said, it's a path for on the path to freedom, not happiness. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to say a little bit more about what surrendering to the dark means, what going into the heart of the trauma, or for you in this book, The Middle Passage,
Yeah,
why that is so important for us on the path.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think whatever we're struggling to name or deal with can be considered darkness or shadow work, if you use that language. Um, Again, like I can't get free until I tend to everything, until I invite everything back into awareness, including the shadowy stuff, the darkness. Even more specifically, my tendency towards violence and how violence manifests for me. But there are specific, kinds of trauma that have felt very dark for me. And I think, pretty skillfully been able to return back into these traumas, because one of the things that I say in the book is that I can't know who I am as a healed person until I figure out who I was before the trauma, or who my community was before the trauma. And so that means I have to like construct these paths back into this darkness to begin to hold the darkness instead of the darkness holding me, or keeping me hostage. So there's like a profound kind of openness, of holding that says, yeah, there's the darkness, there's the violence, there's the trauma, that here's the history my people have survived. Here's the ugliness, here's the rage, whatever it may be for you. The heartbreak, right? And to hold space for everything, that arises, and to experience that darkness, that heartbreak, and to learn how to let it go, and to say, you know what, I think I'm finished with this, and release it, as well. Um, I would say in America, like we have this little tendency right now to try to erase the path. And when the past and the path actually, but definitely the past, we're trying to rewrite history. We're trying to barricade history off, but it just doesn't disappear. Trauma just doesn't disappear because I don't want to name it, right? It will turn into something else, right? And this is why going back, moving into consuming, holding space is imperative, is necessary for freedom. And I know it scares the shit out of us, you know. But yes, I claim this space as a new saint, but you also have to know that I've done work. I've done work, right? Heartbreaking work, which I talk about in the book. I talk about this in New Saints. I've talked about it in Love and Rage, my last book. So I've documented this. So when you read this or when you think about me, you have to understand that I do this. This isn't something I talk shit about. I talk shit about a lot of stuff, but like that, not suffering, not trauma, not healing, like this is something I take really seriously, and I respect, I respect the darkness, you know, and I also understand darkness to be other energies that don't want me to be free, that are actually actively trying to get in my way, of experiencing community and resourcefulness and freedom and safety. I totally get that. Absolutely. And even those energies must be cared for. Sometimes you have to exercise them as well, but you have to you have to care for them, right? And just another small point too is that, like, when you actually go for freedom itself, everything else is going to happen, like the joy, the happiness, all that's going to happen. But if you just go for happiness, that's just like a plateau experience. It's limited. So I want to go for everything. So me going for complete liberation from all the causes and conditions of suffering, for me, it's like everything. I want everything. That's the audaciousness, right? That's confidence. I deserve everything because I am already a Buddha. I'm just trying to get back home to that, right? Go for who you are, not for who you think you are. You know?
Thank you. One of the questions that has come in is about the role of spiritual friends and community
Mm-hmm.
for the new saint and on the path to freedom.
Incredibly important. But I want to make one point here too. No matter how deeply immersed we are in community or sangha or relationships, there's still going to be a level of loneliness that we have to hold for ourselves. Because liberation, yes, we can work collectively to get free, but the experience of freedom is an individual experience. It's definitely I am expanding from ego, or I am realizing the illusory nature of everything. Yes. And that I dissolves and returns back to we, right? But that narrow passage, that threshold, we get to the threshold, it's us, not our best friends, not our Sangha mates, not our Kalamitras and so forth and so on. Like, it's us that has to lean into this experience of final awakening, right? No one else can make that choice for you. This is why the loneliness comes up. Like, I have to choose this. I have to choose liberation for myself. I can't just sit in the crowd and let everyone raise their hand while I'm just sitting in the back going, you know what, they answered for me. I'll just tag along with their work. No, it's like when we all are asked, we all have to individually say yes to this. No one can carry you to freedom, but we can travel together with others around us towards freedom.
Thinking of relationships with others and with the many others, historical others and contemporary others, forgiveness is really important for you. Not any kind of facile forgiveness that bypasses and obscures trauma, injury, violence. But freedom also does ultimately involve forgiveness. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to say a few words about that.
Yeah. I think ultimately, yes, this is about forgiving others, but it's also first about forgiving ourselves. In New Saints, I have this process around self-forgiveness, which I think is something that we kind of bypass, but it's very particular. Tara Brach said she loved it. She's going to teach it to her Sangha. So that's a little bit of validation there. If Tara Brach likes it, then we all should love it, right? In the same way, if Beyonce loves something, we should all love it. But I'm not saying Beyonce and Tara Brach are the same person, obviously. But I think that there's a part of us, even when we've survived harm, where we still blame ourselves for being victims or somehow contributing to the conditions by which we experienced harm. And I think that when we experience harm, I think the first thing we need to do is to make sure that we're getting the care that we need to heal, not necessarily trying to forgive other people. right? And I think the culture of forgiveness is dominated by perpetrators, not by the people who have actually survived harm. And by the way, we're both perpetrators and survivors, by the way, you know? So again, it's like being good. Like sometimes we hurt and sometimes we are hurt. And sometimes we're doing both at the same time, you know? But I want us to just pay attention to these really, sometimes it can be really like strong experiences or feelings of personal blame, but they can also be really subtle kind of experiences of personal blame. So basically it's like I do the work of forgiving myself, and I have a whole process in the book that you go through. And then once I feel resourced enough, then I can turn my attention back to the person who hurt me and try to offer forgiveness. And forgiveness means that it's not that I forget what's been done to me, it's when I get to a point where I believe that I have a right to experience care. And when I forgive others, it gets me back to the point where no matter how pissed off I am at you, I still want you to have what you need to be free and safe and resourced. Right. So my forgiveness doesn't mean I'm no longer angry. It means that like I still want you to be free. Right. From the conditions that created this exchange of harm to begin with. You know, and that for me cuts through retribution or like, you know, whatever, like this, it's restorative. Forgiveness is often what I say. It's restorative, right? When I want people to be resourced and happy and safe, there's something that's been restored in terms of my relationship and my belief in the capacity of people um, to change and to heal.
Thanks. There's a question that came in about what you were just talking about. If you and you talk about this in the book, but maybe you could say a few words about how we come to forgive ourselves. I know you have practices in the book, but and how we accept parts of ourselves that we have been trained to think are not so attractive.
Yeah. Yeah. I think first, you know, it's really doing this work of, again, choosing the discomfort and saying, yeah, this is painful. Yeah, I've been taught not to look at this, to tend to this, but I have to turn back now. Um, this is also where community is really important. So I think when we have others in our lives who embody this kind of like loving, caring kind of forgiveness, it becomes easier. Um, and this is why I think that, again, we have to be really clear about who we're around, or who our friends are, and who we spend time with. And I am very intentional about investing in relationships that are really about, are based on real love and care that I have with this person and vice versa, right? Um, to know that you're also not the only one doing this in this moment, that like you, that this is the path that all Buddhas have journeyed to remember and to return back to their Buddha nature, their Buddhahood, you know. And this is why I also ask for support, for care. This is why I have the practice called the Seven Homecomings practice, which I talk about in Love and Rage. This is why, you know, I call in my resources to support me, to help me, to hold me as I'm doing this really grueling labor of trying to get the experience of care into these really dark places in my experience. Yeah, so I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, a related question that came in was about the relationship between doing shadow work as part of one's practice and the need for a therapist,
Yeah.
um, and not losing. when does one really need to go to see somebody else?
I'm pro therapy, so I think that's a really wonderful idea if we are resourced, if we have the resources to do so. Um, but shadow work, I think, has to be supported by someone else or community. Like you need others to reflect back to you, what you think you know or what you're struggling with, right? Just to hear things being reflected back to me is by someone else has been really, really helpful for me. But we can, when we're just doing things on our own, we can definitely bullshit ourselves, thinking that we're actually getting free, but we're actually getting deeper, right, into suffering, right? And so communicating, having these kind of restorative relationships with people, be it a mental health professional or someone like that, I think is such a wonderful idea.
There are a number of really wonderful questions, and I want to apologize to everybody who did not get their question answered. Um, we have a few more minutes. And Lama Rod, I'm wondering if you would be willing to say a little bit about the Bhumi Sparsha project,
Yeah.
which isn't necessarily part of the book, though it's related.
Right. So Buddhist Parsha is, mostly an online community that Lama Justin, Van Boydash, and I started working on, I guess, 7 or 8 years ago by now. And we just wanted to, you know, help create a community that essentially made Tantra accessible, but accessible through community, not necessarily accessible through teachers, if that makes sense. But it's a space where we often say we like to experiment with this really traditional model of Tantra community, and sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not, sometimes we don't know, but we're definitely moving through a transition right now in the community. But I think that is extremely necessary to do. I I struggle like it's a I in terms of devotion to teachers. I really struggle when we don't feel as if we have agency to make choices in a devotional relationship with teachers. And my project in American Buddhism, wherever it may be at this point, is to remind us that devotion doesn't mean I just completely surrender my agency to an authority, a spiritual authority. It means that like I am being reminded that I have to choose how to move through my practice, because ultimately my teacher isn't going to get me free. It's my agency and practice and reducing suffering that's going to get me free. That's real devotion. Devotion is remembering that I have a right to be free and that there are others modeling that freedom for me, but like they're not going to like put me on their backs and walk me over to liberation, that so that's what we're trying to do in Bhumi Sparsha. We have all kinds of programs every week, community sets, deity practices, protector practices, um, and so forth. So you can just head over to the website, look at that, if you're interested.
Thank you. And if you're interested, Lama Rod is offering a program on spiritual abolition, emphasizing a particular Mahayana sutra in July of 2024 at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. And if you're interested, you could go to buddhistinquiry.org. We have set it up as a lottery, so people will enter into the lottery because there'll be more people than we can accommodate. There are two more parts of our time together. We're going to end with Lama Rod offering a little bit more meditation and a dedication. But before we ended with Lama Rod, I just wanted to say a few words about new saints and old saints and a way of life that is built on trust and community and a certain amount of risk. And that is the way of life of dana, of generosity. Dana is the first virtue of the bodhisattva because it is simultaneously meeting the needs of others and relinquishing something that I've been attached to and can let go of. It doesn't mean relinquishing things that we need. We need to take care of ourselves. Um, and the teacher needs to take care of themselves. Lama Rod lives on that lovely block in Atlanta, but it costs living in a capitalist society. Um, we are a kind of little village here, but Lama Rod can't just walk out with his bowl, going from Zoom room to Zoom room to Zoom room to support himself. We need to support him in other ways, and he comes to us to offer freely. And to me, I find this deeply moving, this tradition that goes way back of offering the Dharma freely, relying on trust that there will be a relationship of care, of awakened care, for lack of a better term, to teach and to support each other. There will be a link in the chat for those of you who would like to support Lama Rod in this work, and also BCBS if you choose. And there's another link that is coming in the chat, which will allow you to give us some feedback. That is also an act of dana, of generosity, to let us know how this worked for you, if there are other programs you might be interested in, and to help us create the kind of new American Buddhism that Lama Rod is talking about. So thank you so much for joining us. And Lama Rod, if you would be willing to end with a meditation and dedication.
Absolutely. Thank you, William. And again, thank you to the Center of BCBS and to Natural Dharma Fellowship for just all the many years of support as well. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for being here tonight. And we're just going to close with just a brief practice. And so again, just returning back to our seats, noticing the weight of our bodies, and the seat rising to hold us. Inviting our awareness back into the space. Again, just noticing whatever there is to notice around us. Returning back to our earlier aspiration and intention that we planted into the earth. And just noticing, what is grown, what is being revealed. And I just invite you just to offer just deep appreciation to all the elements of our practice, to all the elements of the space that's come together. I'm just inviting us to offer appreciation to the earth, to the seat, to our bodies, maybe even to all of our teachers and mentors and elders, and all of the beings we consider saints, thanking them for influencing, supporting our practice. We offer a deep appreciation to this online virtual community that's all come together tonight to hold this conversation. Deep appreciation to all the organizers that made this happen. And on behalf of our collective, I pray that all the positive energy, all the good merit, all the great karma that we've accumulated together, this karma, this merit that's about all beings, regardless of who they are, getting free and transcending all the causes and conditions of suffering and harm, to remember their innate liberatory states as Buddhas, as sacred divine beings, that we dedicate all of this energy out to all beings, that they too become whatever they need to become in order to do the work of liberation. That we all be free as quickly as possible. Thank you all so much. Buy the book. It's actually out on Tuesday. So so you won't get it until Tuesday or after, but thank you all so much.
Thank you, Lama Rod. And if anybody's interested, you can unmute yourself now and say goodbye to everyone briefly before we close the room.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Lama Rod.
Thank you, Lama Rod.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Bye,
William.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night. Take care.
Bye. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good luck
night.
sleeping off the eclipse,
Thanks so
everybody.
much. Many blessings.